am the chair, vice chair, because there is no chair. Councilmember Dennis Pizine, Councilmember Janice Hahn, my colleague, will not be joining us. We have 3 items on the agenda, and we will begin with number 1.
Item number 1 is the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment to present a verbal report on the status of neighborhood council equipment inventories and withholding funds to neighborhood councils that are not in compliance.
Okay.
They're not here.
Here they are.
Hey, perfect timing.
Item number 1,
For the second time.
Department of Neighborhood Empowerment to present verbal report on status of neighborhood councils equipment inventories and withholding funds to neighborhood councils that are not in compliance.
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair.
It's 3:30, way past morning.
This committee used to be held in the morning, that's why I'm in the habit.
You're right. It did. And it looks the same. And the sunlight, and that's about it.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Bongwan Kim from Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, and I'm here to give you a verbal update on the request from the committee to do an inventory of all the equipment that was purchased by neighborhood councils since the beginning of time. And I'm here to report to you that 84 of 89 neighborhood councils have responded. We have the neighborhood councils that have not responded are Canoga Park, Central Alameda, Greater Cypress Park, Historic Cultural, and Woodland Hills Warner Center. There are a variety of reasons for non-compliance. There's some internal disagreements amongst the board, and they're unable to take actions. There's also some inability to collect the information that's necessary to fill out the inventory form. If you want more detailed information, we have a breakdown of individual neighborhood councils.
I just want to make sure that if they're not complying, they're not receiving any funding or any reimbursements,
That's
period.
correct. We froze the funds of the neighborhood councils that are not complying.
Wonderful.
And upon further request of the committee, we will prepare a report giving you an idea of the responses by neighborhood councils
Now,
for the
well, the
inventory.
84, the 89 responded. Did they give answers to the questions on equipment, or was it unknown, unknown, unknown?
That's what we're compiling now. So, you know, all of them answered the questions to varying degrees of knowledge about where the equipment is at. So that's
Okay.
what we'll present to you in terms of how they responded by neighborhood council. And some of them said, you know, the prior boards had taken the equipment, they don't know where it's at. And some of the boards took the time to try to track down the equipment.
Then, since it's city equipment, would it be appropriate to file theft reports, loss reports, misappropriation of public funds reports on those individuals and seek the assistance of the law enforcement, the city attorney, the DA? I know there's been some indictments for people who absconded with money.
Yes.
This, to me, is the same thing. And if this, I don't know, doesn't really cut it.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about $50,000 for the last number of years.
Right.
Items purchased, and when they do that purchase, you get a copy of what the item was, what they spent the money on.
Correct.
If they can't account for that, then there's obviously very serious problems, and those folks need to be, need to understand that we're just not gonna close our eyes and say, well, that's okay. And if we need to bring in the police to do more investigations or cease any additional funding for any of the programs. I mean, I suspected it, but then when I read the article, how many people they've discovered versus how many are potential, just didn't really care. I mean, it's again, we talk about the public funds that are diminishing.
The next steps that I would do based on their responses, if they can't account for the equipment, and it'll be on a case-by-case basis, and we'll have a discussion with each of the neighborhood council boards. If I feel that it was their responsibility to track the equipment, and if they can't account for it, then we'll seek some kind of restitution. And if the restitution approach does not work, then the proper law enforcement agencies will be brought in.
Yeah, I think we need to take a zero tolerance to people who rip off the city, because they're ripping off the city, ripping off the taxpayers. Right. I know I have a city printer at home, and just this past week, they asked for the number, because they track that, and they keep those documents where the equipment is and who's using it. I use it for city business. I've got a laptop hooked up to that. I used to have a city computer, which I now have a laptop that I purchased, but it's the city printer, and they keep track of all that. They do audits, they make sure they've got numbers on them, which is what the neighborhood council should be doing. If they haven't, then they're obviously negligent, but it's been brought to their attention.
Right.
So I
Well, it
trust
was-
they'll follow through.
It was my action that resulted in the criminal investigations, because when I did see some highly unusual expenses on the online database, then I instructed my staff to look into it further, and based upon our internal investigation, we found it was merited to report to the law enforcement authorities. So just for your information, I am in the process of a major redesign of the whole funding system. So one of the policies that I'll be looking to implement as part of a number of system improvements that need to be made is not to allow neighbor councils to purchase equipment through purchase cards, but they would be required to only purchase equipment through the city's check writing process. So that way we can be sure to track every piece of equipment
Okay.
going forward.
I know you inherited a lot of those problems, and trying to sort them out is not an easy task. And we
I
discussed it.
appreciate you making that distinction.
Oh, absolutely. When we discussed this at the empowerment meeting at Saturday,
Yes.
I think I made that point very clear about their responsibility, and that it wasn't on your shoulders. You're trying to clean up the mess that was created.
Right.
Okay. Very good. So we'll continue that matter and get further updates.
Thank you.
So thank you. And we have a question, on number one, Ida Kalali.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I belong to the Greater Echo Park Coalition Neighborhood Council,
Okay.
and I cannot vote because my vote has been rescinded by the Chief Information Officer, and perhaps Dunn could best explain this. However, I am here as a stakeholder. One, the inventory was never run past the full board and discussed. It was done in practical isolation. I do not think that it is advisable for such an item to take place and be handed over to Dunn without having it run past the entire board. The fact is, problems arise during the transition phase when the outgoing treasurer and the incoming treasurer come in. There is no checks and balances that occur, and I think this transition phase is extremely important. It has to be a phase where one treasurer hands over the reins to the next, and what they each hand each other has to be double-checked, and Dunn has to be there, and the full board has to be there. There needs to be a stricter handling of neighborhood council's monetary affairs. I also think that during the quarterly reports, inventory is extremely important. Whatever is purchased during that quarter has to be recorded there with all the information so that even the board can track it. At the present time, it is unknown, and usually you can only hold on to things for 2 years because there is no checks and balances, and I really think that it is essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. All right, we'll continue that matter in this committee. Number 2, please.
Item number 2 is the city clerk report relative to the administration of the 2010 Neighborhood Council Board member elections.
Good afternoon, Councilman.
Good afternoon.
June Lagme with the City Clerk's Office, and with me is Isais Cantu from our election division. I thought I would just take a moment and just very simply and clearly articulate for you a little of the history of how the City Clerk came to assume administration of the Neighborhood Council elections, what we learned from 2008 and where we are headed for in 2010. So in June 2008, at the council's direction, per ordinance, the city clerk successfully and for the first time conducted elections for 22 neighborhood council boards. This was the clerk's pilot effort. In 2010, next year, the clerk will administer approximately 90 neighborhood council board elections. Our challenge will be to strike a proper balance between adhering to each of those 90 neighborhood councils' distinct, unique features while conducting the overall neighborhood council election process in a standard way, as we would a regular municipal election. The neighborhood council elections will take place in a 7-month period between December 2009 and July 2010. Including all the stages, from the early stages of candidate filing to the final active election certification. The elections will take place by region. Thus, all neighborhood councils in one region will have their election on the same day. There are 9 regions total, so there will be 9 separate election days that will handle the 90 neighborhood councils. But there will be still 90 polling locations, staffed, supplied, open, and available throughout the 9 regions affected. All the polling places will remain open for 6 consecutive hours between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. on their respective election days. It is estimated that as many as 1,500 or more board seats might be up for the elections. It is possible that the clerk could process more than 6,500 potential candidates for all 9 election regions. We anticipate having over 400 distinct ballot types versus the typical 50 to 58 ballot types in a typical municipal election. After each region's election, the clerk will have 7 business days to complete an initial tally and final canvass of all ballots cast and to certify the election results. Official results will be released region by region. The final cost amount estimated by the clerk to conduct these 90 elections was $2.02 million. We did remove mass mailing efforts, media, public service announcements. We removed a comprehensive vote by mail program, and we removed purchase of certain software and licensing. This was due to the city's financial condition, to reduce our amount to $1.905 million. Our office will make every effort to continue to trim our costs to fit the $1.905 that was allocated to us for this purpose. Our election staff is present. They can give you details on the many and ongoing efforts that we are assuming to solicit input and recommendations from all the neighborhood councils and from the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, such as the advisory role of the Neighborhood Council Election Development Group, which was established as an advisory committee, the ongoing participation by clerk election staff at various and numerous neighborhood council events, and our ongoing monthly strategy meetings between clerk management and Dunn management. Election staff can also fill you in, if you wish, on the unique set of election documents for this unprecedented effort. We have developed a stipulation worksheet, which allowed the neighborhood councils to confirm their election-specific bylaws necessary to conduct the neighborhood council board elections. Happily, 94% of all neighborhood councils submitted such stipulation worksheets or opted for the default citywide election values. The stipulation worksheet was the Rosetta Stone that allowed our office to develop each neighborhood council's election unique procedures. Our office also was instrumental in developing the election policies, the election procedures and planning template, developing all necessary forms and applications for the election, and developing a neighborhood council volunteer poll worker program. With this extreme effort, approximately 70 poll workers will be required to work the elections next year. Poll workers will consist of city clerk election staff and a number of trained neighborhood council volunteer poll workers. This is an overview of the formal report that we submitted to the committee. I and my election staff are available to answer any specific questions that you may have.
Couple of questions. On the 70 poll workers, are they going to be paid for that?
I'm sorry, say again,
The
sir?
70 poll workers, are they going to be paid?
The poll workers who are city clerk election staff will be paid. The previous EN committee chair asked that we investigate soliciting unpaid volunteer poll workers from the neighborhood councils themselves. We are currently doing that. They will be integrated with the paid staff, so it'll be a combination of paid and unpaid staff.
And is that gonna come out of the 1.950 or the 2.2 million?
That is correct for the
That
city
includes
clerk
the-
paid staff, yes.
That includes that part. Would it be cheaper if you explored strictly and not have the poll workers, not have the staff other than a vote by mail? Has that been explored simply and eliminate everything else? Have the vote by mail for neighborhood councils?
The decision was made at the time that this budget was put together that vote by mail would be restricted to only those who are physically incapable of attending their polling place and will be available upon request only. So at this stage in our development, we are not equipped to do all vote by mail. Isais?
Correct. My name is Isaias Cantu. I'm a senior project coordinator for the Election Division. We had previously developed a budget that included an all vote by mail process, but the savings for implementing that process did not really pan out compared to our current implementation.
And what percent do you think will vote
Pardon?
based upon past elections?
Pardon?
What percent do you estimate will vote?
The turnout.
Turnout.
Turnout,
Turnout will range per neighborhood council,
the high and low.
high and low. I don't have those numbers with me.
Because in the city council election, we just had, I think, a 12% turnout.
It just cleared double digits, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, can I interject? Arlene Taylor, Election Division. I think
Arlene, come to the microphone if you would.
the difference is with the city, the municipal election, there's a pool of registered voters, and that's the pool you use to determine the turnout figures. However, with the neighborhood council elections, for each election, the stakeholders will register. And so whoever shows up will vote. So it's a raw number. You can't really say out of those eligible to vote, there was a certain turnout.
And how do they verify if they're a constituent, a resident, a stakeholder in that particular election?
Okay, depending on the individual neighborhood council's bylaws or election procedures, some have chosen self-affirmation, where a stakeholder would come in and say, I am a stakeholder,
No verification.
none beyond that. Or there are those that are requiring documentation. And we've laid out the types of documentation that we would accept to verify either residency, ownership, whatever category the neighborhood council has determined they need an office in.
If we're gonna spend close to $2 million on an election, why couldn't we impose upon the neighborhood councils some verification of those that are voting that they're qualified, and not just, I live at such and such a location? Because I'm sure there's gotta be some voter fraud somewhere.
I think when the neighborhood councils were first developed, and actually I think Easy can answer that better than I, they were given it was left to them how they were going to determine stakeholder status,
But they weren't
and
given $50,000. They weren't given money.
they were from the very beginning. So they've always,
Not in the charter. The charter didn't give them $50,000. Mayor Hahn gave them $50,000.
but from the beginning, from the early days of the neighborhood councils, they were allowed to determine whether they wanted to require documentation of any stakeholders, or if they were going to allow the stakeholders to self-affirm that they are a stakeholder and therefore they should be allowed to vote. And I think the idea was that if you do self-affirmation, it makes it a very open process, and you might get more participation versus perhaps some people who might be put off by having to show some form of documentation.
Or you might get a developer that wants to build a project and get his construction crew to come in and vote.
I think that's the trade-off, and that's why it was left to the neighborhood councils to make that decision of what fit well with their, particular neighborhood.
But that was when it was not as sophisticated as it is now, with $2 million estimated to run the election. And sometimes things have to change, and then we've had the situation of theft, embezzlement, other corruption, felony crimes with neighborhood council members who are elected by the people. I just think it's so loose. And if the neighborhood council was doing it on their own, but now we have the city clerk who's appointed to do a specific purpose, to keep it clean, to keep it right. I just think it doesn't serve a purpose if we don't have stakeholders, and it doesn't matter where they're from. fact is they're a stakeholder as defined by a stakeholder, whether you show a gas bill, or you show a water and power bill, you show a driver's license, or you show anything, doesn't matter how they're here, but the fact is they're living there, and they're not just coming in to stack the votes to get board people who will then influence the decisions, especially on development, which I've seen take place, which really dilutes the effectiveness of a neighborhood council, because it's not that neighborhood, it's special interest driven. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Gwen Poindexter, City Attorney. That may all be true, and that's really a policy question, but just in defense of the city clerk, their job is to administer the elections and to honor the bylaws. So that might be an issue before Dunn or before the board of neighborhood commissioners, or even before city council, if they want to standardize their bylaws and require a certain type of identification. But, you know, the city clerk can't change that rule. They're just honoring
Maybe
what's
they can't
existing.
change it, but I think for the benefit of the communities, they should change it. We have some neighborhood councils aren't even complying with giving us the information on what they use.
Understand.
I mean, it gets so loose, then it gets so corrupt, then it destroys everything that people have worked for to try and establish neighborhood participation, grassroots.
But the city council could change the rule. If it wants to amend the plan and tweak the system in that way, it can certainly do that.
Yeah. It just troubles me that it's too loose, and I think the looser it gets, the more troublesome it gets. And we weren't spending millions of dollars before running elections. They were coming out of the neighborhood council's budget. But now we're saying that they're not going to spend that money. It's going to come to the clerk's office. Mr. Smith?
Mr. Chairman, Paul Smith, CLA. I think when Frank first came to the committee and laid out his plan for the city clerk to undertake the elections, one of the things he said to us was that for the first round, they were going to go by the bylaws that were in place. After they had conducted the election, look at the results of the election, and made some evaluation, they may come back and make some recommendation to make changes along the lines that you're suggesting.
This will be the first widespread elections. You've done partial, this will be the full.
Correct. Previously in 2008, we did 22 neighborhood councils.
Right.
This is our full implementation of all the neighborhood council elections.
Okay, well, then maybe we could watch that and then make some recommendations and make some changes based upon the fuller view. I just think that we need to do something to tighten it up. It has legitimacy versus what it is now. I've heard dogs that have voted and all kinds of.
That was prior to the city clerk implementing elections.
Yeah, but maybe a dog voting, because they live there, they're residents, so if the dog votes, I mean, it really dilutes democracy and empowerment of a community.
And that's the approach we're taking. After having learned quite a great deal during 2008, we've used that experience to inform the 2010 implementation process. After 2010, definitely we will take that approach of evaluating everything we've gone through, sitting down with the neighborhood councils and getting their feedback and developing a new approach for 2012.
How many bizarre cases have you heard of?
Bizarre.
Bizarre, crazy, nutty, cuckoo. Come on, June.
There are some.
Give me the most outrageous, other than the dog voting.
Other than the dog voting.
No, I'm not going to blame you. You run my Harley Davidson. You don't criticize a lady who rides on a Harley, even though you didn't travel more than 2 feet. It was a parade. Okay.
Yeah. They're just, again, the dog voting is, I think, the more bizarre of them all.
Or like little kids, 4 and 5-year-olds voting?
There have been situations in some neighborhood councils where children have been walked from their classroom to vote. There have been other neighborhood council elections where people have been paid in chips and soda to vote. So all of those have been taken into consideration when we started developing our means of implementing elections.
Right, okay.
And
So
based on
you're aware of what I'm concerned with?
Correct.
Okay, so I think what happens is we run it, and then we analyze, and then we come before the council to say we need to tighten this up because we've seen some situations that really aren't appropriate.
Correct.
And that way it'll be better for everybody. And then we have legitimacy added to it.
But I want to say, Councilman, that the clerk is not going into this with a what the heck, let's see what happens
No, I
attitude.
understand.
We are putting our best thought processes forward, and
I just want to make it legit for everybody in Los Angeles, and the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment is still developing. We've got a general manager who has a lot of challenges because of what's happened in the past. You're new to the election process with that. You know how to run municipal elections. You've got one coming up. You just finished one. People don't criticize the clerk's office for not running legitimate elections. And what I'm trying to do is just say, if we're going to have neighborhood councils, then we're going to have some legitimacy, and we're going to have it done in a fashion that is within reason. I mean, when kids are taken out of classrooms, or dogs, or, you know, and then it makes a joke of the whole system. And then we're spending $2 million, or near $2 million to say, what are we doing? Then it throws it all out. Say, we don't need these things. Just, you know, take the money away and don't do anything. I'm just trying to keep it moving forward in a positive fashion, so it doesn't get the criticism of, you know, what a joke it's become. So, no, I see where you're coming from, and I support that. So we'll analyze it after, and Dunn will be monitoring, and we'll make some recommendations at that point, which I think will be beneficial for everybody. Just like the blue line, the orange line, our transit line, when they installed that, I said, why don't they put some barriers where you have to go through a barrier to show you've paid? Well, then they came up with this, we'll do the honor system. So you just get on and maybe you buy a ticket, maybe you don't. Well, they've done some analysis and they find a whole bunch of people aren't buying tickets. So they're riding it for free, which means that we're all subsidizing that instead of everyone paying their fair share, as they do in other cities. You gotta go through a barrier and you gotta put the ticket through. Here, it's just jump on and have a good old time. That's what I'm trying to make sure we don't have, shall we say, the dishonest evaluation that then criticizes what we're trying to do with the community empowerment. And I know certain people get involved, other people don't, with the neighborhood empowerment, and we want them to all get involved, but unfortunately it doesn't happen that way, and maybe down the road it will. So we will then receive and file this, and so you don't know if you're gonna get 1.95 or 2.0.
The budget gave us 1.905, and we are going to do our very darndest to keep it within that figure, and we believe we can.
Okay. Well, you've done well so far.
I credit my election staff. They're great.
They do a good job. But every ship needs a captain. You're the captain of the ship.
I was co-captain on your Harley, sir.
Yeah, you were the co-captain. I don't think you'd be good riding down the street in the front. We both could crash in that. Okay. So we'll receive and file that, note and file that matter. And I thank you for your information on that.
Thank you very much,
Thank
sir.
you.
We are in total agreement with your point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, oh wait, we have a comment on that too. Ida Talali. Ida Talali. On number 2. And then you'll be back on number...
Public comments.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, go ahead, you're on number...
Good afternoon. I am delighted with the questions that you have asked, and I'm encouraged by what the city clerk's office is doing despite the limitations of their budget. However, I think you asked a very important question as to some of the bizarre things. You haven't heard the most bizarre.
Well, tell me.
I ran against, in 2008, I ran against a dead candidate. He had been dead for 3 weeks. And they left his name on as living because they felt that his votes were vote by mail.
Did he win?
Yes, unfortunately. And I was never reappointed to the seat. That was vacated. But that is the past. Hopefully it won't occur.
Well, we make sure he won't run again.
Yeah, thank you. I also think that you have loopholes because people, by the very nature of the way they register to vote, can vote 5 times. In other words, they can vote for the executives 5 times and then in each district. I think those loopholes need to be, they needn't occur. I also, so streamlining is very important. Tracking of outside voters, absolutely. They have no place in changing the dynamics in a community. They are not vested interest, and I think this needs to be looked at more carefully. As for the volunteer corps, I hope that they will not serve in the districts or in the regions that their neighborhood council. They need to go to a totally different, because in the past, you had people that were self-serving. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've completed number 3. Number 2, I'm sorry, number 3.
Item number 3 is a motion by Labange Parks relative to an ordinance which would permit the enforcement of curfew laws on school grounds, as well as permit citation of curfew offenders on the first offense.
Who's here for number 3? How you doing, Cap?
Good, sir. How are you?
The captain and the commander.
How you doing, yes, sir?
Good, good. And we got the working detective. Okay.
It's Fabian Lizarraga, Captain Commanding Officer of Juvenile Division. This is having to do with the ordinance that was written up, having to do with I believe it was a city council motion for enforcement of the curfew violations for students. We've been working on this for a while now, and right now we're working with where we're at is we're still working with the school district to see if there's any kind of reference or check system that we can put into place when our patrol officers run into somebody that's either on school grounds or near them, to see if they are actually a student at that school or are they a student somewhere else. We're having some trouble with coordinating some kind of centralized number. School district is hesitant to provide information over the telephone to officers, citing that they don't know who they're talking to. And so we're trying to see if what we can do to implement that. So we're trying to see if there's a one-stop number that officers throughout the city can use to check in, rather than having them call every school within their area to see if.
Make it practical.
Correct. So that's
So should we continue this until we get those matters resolved?
that would be my recommendation. I don't know.
Because if you guys are working on it, then I don't want to impede that. Darryl?
Darryl Powell from the CLA's office. What we would recommend is that the police department work with the city attorney's office in doing a report back to committee on this item.
But they still have the school district deal with it. The school district has the records. So the thing that I find with this interesting is they want to do curfew violations on school grounds.
Truancy.
Truancy. Truancy on school grounds. Is after school or during school or?
This would be after school, but what's happened is the way the city attorney has worded it, it's kind of taken out the truancy aspect of it and made it basically a daytime curfew and a nighttime curfew. The nighttime curfew kind of stays the same as it always
10
been.
o'clock at night.
Exactly. The daytime curfew has to do with whether or not you're in school, which is the old truancy.
But
So
you're in school though. I mean, you're on school grounds.
you're on school grounds, and this had to do with when we had the walkouts a couple years ago.
Okay.
And trying to make sure that we weren't, they had the right to be able to voice their opinions and things like
I
that.
see, okay. That makes a point.
So are you saying that the school district is not being cooperative? Their staff isn't?
Well, I wouldn't term it that way. It's just that they're hesitant. They're citing they don't know how to get around the confidentiality issues. We're trying to work with them to say, if we're going to enforce this and if we're going to pass this and enforce it in the city of Los Angeles, it would make sense.
May I ask one question?
Yeah.
Have you gone as far as the superintendent's office in speaking to them?
We've gone to the representative for the superintendent's office
What is that?
with their legal people. We've gotten the city attorney for our side and their attorney, and they're still haggling.
I think it might help if the superintendent's assistant gets involved in this, and that's Dr. Sharon Robinson. She's been very helpful
Okay.
to me in terms of getting information, and so I'd suggest you give her a call.
Okay.
I can get the number for you.
Okay.
So why don't we continue this for 60 days? And you can work with the clerk, work with the school district,
And I'll give them the number.
and see if we can get some resolution. I think it's an important issue. especially when you got thousands of students that decide to take a walk, and who's responsible in case something happens to them.
Correct.
So then it puts the police department in an awkward position too, if you don't have the authority to do something.
Yes, sir.
On the grounds, off grounds, so. All right, well, let's continue this for 60 days to get some better description and maybe more cooperation from school district. Interesting how they don't want to give information to the police, but they'll give it to their police officers. I mean, we are the police department.
Yeah.
Or
And
you
we,
are the
we,
police department.
we did invite the school PD to come to this committee meeting, and we weren't able to get somebody here, but we'll try and put a little bit more pressure, see if we can get them to the next one.
Yeah, we can order them through the search and seizure with Chief Mannion. Able to do that. We also have, Mr. McQuiston sent in a correspondence on this, and it relates to school grounds are not city property, must be a permit from the property owner for the arrest of persons occupying the property. That is usually accomplished by the property owner posting no trespassing sign plus a letter which authorizes police to arrest persons trespassing without personal cause to the property owner. Curfew violations must be occupied the property at a time when no trespassing order is enforced. Time would be when the school ground is closed to the public. Does not require city ordinance to permit police to arrest curfew violations on school property if the no trespass order is enforced, but then the public is permitted on the property and juveniles must be admitted also. Maybe the intent to restrict gang activity during times the public is allowed on the premises, but remember that such activity may occur during school hours if gang members are enrolled in the school. Curfew control would thus be meaningless regarding restricting gang activity. Schools are used for programs not related to the school's curriculum. For example, the police department has one program for youth susceptible to joining gangs and one for incorrigibles, but both operate on school grounds. When the school is not in session, an ordinance requiring curfew violations might jeopardize the continuance of these critical programs, lead to a lower quality of life in the area. Why not instead get the school to erect appropriate signs warning not to interlopers not to do so, compelled with the authorization letter to the police so that there is bright line regarding when persons may occupy school property and which part may be occupied, thus empowering the police to protect the public safety without proposed ordinance. That's from Mr. McQuiston. I'll give this to you and you can maybe review that to see if there's anything pertinent. He's an attorney who testifies before this committee frequently.
Yes, sir.
So we've sent that forward. And Ida, back again for one more public comment. Yes. And then we will conclude. So we're going to continue that for 60 days. Thank you, gentlemen. And your final comment on public comment, ma'am?
Yes. I just want to go back to the neighborhood councils because I'm concerned with the lawlessness, indifference, and the loss of opportunity because it deprives communities of growth and utilizing city funds to the fullest. The recent publicity of 6 neighborhood councils being investigated for fraud does not shock us onlookers. Communities are being deprived of more than the loss of funds. In many cases, neighborhoods are being robbed of vision, thoughtful service by the bullying tactics of many of their neighborhood councils. The leadership has cast aside the Brown Act, Robert's Rules of Order, the bylaws, the Code of Civility. In many cases, to maintain such a direction, they have even done away with the grievance process or sabotaged it. While they might not have stolen funds for personal use, many neighborhood councils operate in a climate where it siphons off funds for pet projects or handouts as rewards. As bad as this is, withholding monies owed to vendors, community groups for services promised or rendered is unacceptable and a major source of dismay in the community. Is it any wonder that meetings draw so few out from the community to attend? The hoarding of funds and then suddenly saying we can't do the project and then spending it on something else that they had originally intended, perhaps. We have executives who refuse to answer questions when asked because the deputy city attorney says you do not have to answer questions. And this is a rule that is, I think, in Robert's rules too, or whatever. But I would just like to say that it is really dismal, some of the performances, and it needs to be looked at beyond just the issue of fraud. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we will conclude at 11.